Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. When we think of the most famous American military heroes in history, names like George Washington, Ulysses Grant, George Patton, Dwight Eisenhower immediately come to mind. But what about Israel Putnam? Odds are you've heard that name, but maybe you don't really know what he accomplished during his illustrious military career. Michael Westerfield has just published a new book, Israel Putnam, America's First Folk Hero. And in it, he recounts one story after another that have largely been forgotten over time, and they are just remarkable. Michael's going to be along in just a moment to fill you in on this amazing individual. This week's trivia question: 70 years ago, there was a fatal car crash in Connecticut, and it was not unlike the Princess Di case in France, where paparazzi were chasing an internationally famous movie star on a back road in Connecticut, only it was the reporter who was killed, not the star. Who was this famous star? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Israel Putnam. Maybe you know of his homestead from the 1700s that still stands in the town of Brooklyn, Connecticut, in the northeast corner, the so-called quiet corner of Connecticut. Or maybe you've been to Putnam Park in Reading on the western side of the state, where Putnam commanded 3 encampments during the winter of 1778. Or maybe you've heard of that large chain that used to stretch under the waterline of the Hudson River near West Point to block the powerful British Navy from navigating north and south along the river. Well, he was responsible for that. Or maybe you've seen the remains of the 100 steep granite steps along Route 1 in Greenwich, where Israel Putnam miraculously rode down with his horse and outmaneuvered a large number of British soldiers who were chasing him, none of whom had the courage to go down those steps like he did. Well, these are just a few of the numerous stories of heroism and achievement attached to this extraordinarily brave military hero. He ranks among the very best military leaders in U.S. history. Well, here to tell us this story is Michael Westerfield. He is author of a fabulous book entitled Israel Putnam, America's First Folk Hero. Michael, I almost don't know where to start, except to first of all commend you on an incredibly good book, this Israel Putnam, America's First Folk Hero. When I first read the title, I thought, is he stretching this? And by the end of the book, I was like, oh my God, he nailed it. It's just amazing. And I think that I'm trying to figure out where my bias was going into it. And I think that we tend to think of military heroes as something different than what he was. He was not an aristocrat. He was not particularly strategic, more sort of a man of the people, a farmer, and didn't write very well, but he spoke incredibly well and used that power when he had to. Probably one of America's greatest military heroes, and yet who would have ever guessed?
Yeah, he was an amazing character. He certainly didn't look like a military leader. Everyone who saw him commented on the fact that he was short and muscular and not fat, but really stocky, built like a brick outhouse. He had no education at all, no formal education at all, maybe 3 months education, and that he was renowned for his writing ability, in which he misspelled about every other word. He had really creative spelling in the age when creative spelling was something of the norm. And yet he rose from being a farm boy to being the Major General of the American Army, second in seniority only to George Washington himself.
Which is just fascinating when you think about it, and I certainly didn't know that, and I suspect a lot of the listeners won't know that. How did he sort of get to that rank?
He signed up at the very beginning of the French and Indian War as a private with the American militia. From that point, he was involved in virtually every action in the French and Indian War from the beginning to the end, and rising in rank as he went along. He started out as a ranger, and he always was pretty much of a ranger. He fought with Rogers of Rogers Rangers. He never was a member of Rogers Rangers, but they fought together often. He was known for his incredible fearlessness. He would always be the one who led troops into danger. when comparing him to Rogers of Rogers' Rangers, they would say Putnam led, whereas Rogers sent his men into battle. Putnam was always leading personally.
I love that. And, people develop reputations over time by some of their heroic efforts and some of the things they do. And before he ever really went onto the battlefield, there was this just classic story from Northeast Connecticut near his hometown where there was a wolf den. Tell us that story.
This is the one thing that they tend to remember him in Northeastern Connecticut for, and that's the killing the last wolf in Connecticut. He had been in Connecticut. His family came from up in Salem Village in Massachusetts, and that's another story because his family was very much involved in the Salem witch trials. But he moved down to Connecticut when he was 21 and took up about 500 acres right on the boundary line between the towns of Brooklyn and Pomfret. And he basically was clearing those 500 acres of virgin land, had done pretty well. Then he was subjected to the wiles of a marauding female wolf, an old wolf, she-wolf, they called her, who in one night killed a large number of his sheep. So he got together with a bunch of neighbors and tracked that wolf in the direction of the Connecticut River. And they finally followed her to a den about a couple of miles just from Putnam's farm. And the whole group were gathered around there trying to figure out how to get the wolf out of the den. They tried smoking it out. They tried sending dogs in. The dogs came out wounded and were afraid to go back in again. And finally, Israel Putnam decided he would have to go into the den and get that wolf. Now, I've been out there and I've been into that den, and I wouldn't want to crawl in there to shoot a wolf. As you go in a little bit, you have to go on your hands and knees, and you have to really crawl in there for a dozen yards or so. And he crawled in there and carrying a torch that he made out of birch bark in one hand, and he had a rope tied around his body so that when he said, "When I tug on that rope, you pull me out of there, boys." And he got in there and saw the wolf's eyes glowing in the light of his torch, and instinctively he jerked on the rope, and the people pulled him out backwards. Came out with his shirt up over his head and kind of all scraped up. And he decided he's going to go back in there again. So he loaded his musket with about a dozen balls of buckshot and crawled into the den. And when he saw those wolf eyes glowing in the light of his torch, he shot the wolf. And I can imagine what that was like, sending off a flintlock rifle in the middle of a rocky den. Must have been blinded and deafened, and they pulled him out once again. He went back in a third time to see if the wolf was dead, and this time they pulled him out. When they pulled him out, he was pulling the wolf by the ears. And ever after that, he was known as Wolf Putnam.
What an unbelievable story. He came to the attention, I guess, of George Washington, and Washington, of course, fought in the French and Indian Wars as well. An interesting thing developed as well, that it wasn't just they who got acquainted and rose up the ranks, but it was their wives as well. Can you explain how that developed?
The wife in question there was Israel Putnam's second wife, and she, in fact, had been married to the pastor in Brooklyn, and then later married to the proprietor of Gardiner's Island. So she was a woman of fairly high status and sophistication. Israel married her, and he gained in sophistication and status from doing that. So she was about of the same class as Martha Washington would have been. And interestingly enough, Washington and Putnam, although they were very different in some ways, were very similar in others. Both of them were farmers, and both of them had very little formal education. Whereas Israel Putnam was outgoing, very gregarious, Washington was reserved, had a difficult time making friends. Israel Putnam could make friends with anybody. Whenever they were together, George and Israel and Martha and Deborah Putnam would have dinner once a week or so, and they really enjoyed having conversations about the old times and the French and Indian War. And Israel Putnam really, for the first couple of years of the Revolutionary War, Israel Putnam was George Washington's go-to man for difficult situations.
Now let's talk about the Revolutionary War and how Israel Putnam got involved, because this is another classic story. So Lexington and Concord happened, and immediately scouts and messengers started riding their horses from Lexington and Concord southbound, and they got to Brooklyn, Connecticut, where Israel Putnam is plowing his field. What did he do?
Israel Putnam was one of the leaders of the committees of correspondence in that area. Israel Putnam, upon receiving the message, he was plowing the field. He left his oxen in the field, jumped on his horse, and rode first to Lebanon, Connecticut, where he talked to the Connecticut's governor, Jonathan Trumbull, and explained to Trumbull what was going on, and arranged that Trumbull would send officers to Brooklyn to meet the people assembling there. Then he rode back to Brooklyn, informed the people, and told them to wait there for the officers. Then he rode the 80 miles up to Concord, joined the people there, and he remained in Concord for a while, collecting all the Minutemen that were coming in, American and Connecticut militia that was showing up there. So he basically was organizing the American army in Concord until such time as other officers got there to take over.
Now, this was, obviously April of 1775 with Lexington and Concord. And it would only be a few months later in June 17th, I guess it was, when Bunker Hill occurred. And I guess, some people know this and other people will be surprised. Israel Putnam was essentially the commander of the Patriot forces during that event, wasn't he?
Well, if you were to ask the British at the time, they'd say he was the commander. If you asked most of the American forces, they would have said he was the commander. But in actual fact, there was no real commander. It was kind of a mess up from the very beginning. The overall command of the troops in the vicinity was Artemus Ward, who's the Major General for Massachusetts. And the colonies agreed that he would be the overall commander, except he was sick. And apparently nobody was appointed to be the commander during the actual battle. Prescott from Massachusetts was the commander in the main fortifications. Putnam was in command of the Connecticut forces. John Stark was in command of the New Hampshire forces. And none of them really knew who they should take orders from or who they should obey. Mostly they were acting fairly independently. Prescott, who in Massachusetts gets the credit for being the hero of the battle, was basically in the redoubt. He was a battlefield commander. Putnam basically was doing everything else. He was writing to the headquarters, arranging for reinforcements, assigning the reinforcements positions when they arrived, writing back and forth, encouraging people on the battlefield, seemingly to be everywhere at once. Putnam was probably the guy who said, "Don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes."
I love it. I'm glad you said earlier that George Washington looked at him as his kind of go-to guy so many times during the Revolutionary War. And I want to give Israel Putnam his due and at the same time paint the true picture of him as you do in your book. This is a guy who you would not turn to for sitting down and drafting out a strategy for where are we going to go. But if you needed something done on the field, if you needed a fortress built, if you needed somebody to command the troops and get them motivated and going, he was your guy, wasn't he?
There was a story I don't know if it was in the book or not, but one staff meeting where all the generals were together with General Washington and they're planning the strategy. And Israel Putnam is out looking out the window, looking out over the field. And Washington says, "Israel, come join us." And Israel said, "You guys plan the battle. I'll fight it."
I don't remember reading that one, so I'm glad you threw that one in here because that's a classic. He's the type of guy, he came up with the idea, as I understand it, at least the locations, if not the idea, for the chains that went across the Hudson River, didn't he, to block the boats?
Yeah, he was in charge of installing the first one, the whole Hudson River campaign. One of the things that was central to Israel Putnam's life was the water corridor from New York City up to Canada. And in the Revolutionary War, for a while, he was in charge of the defenses on the Hudson River. He tended to be assigned to impossible positions. The guy who got the job of defending lost causes really against incredibly superior odds. And he was also the guy who picked out the location for West Point, so that he was really responsible for two chains across the Hudson River. The one that was down towards Fishkill, and then later the one that was up by West Point.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and it's an amazing for people who know the story of the chain across, to block the British boats coming up. I mean, that was on Israel Putnam's plate, and it's just one of a million stories. And we're not going to do justice to Israel Putnam in this podcast episode. People literally, and I'm not just saying this because you're here, but they really have to read your book because it really summarizes it so well, better than I could ever do in this episode. But I do want to get a couple stories in because at one point now, Washington has him more or less covering the area between western Connecticut over to the Hudson. And this is the winter encampment in Reading, Connecticut. And of course, people know that there's Putnam Park there now, which, by the way, was the very first public park in the state of Connecticut, which is another feather in his cap. While he was there, he's on patrol down in Greenwich. And tell us what happened at that famous incident.
This is one of the more famous things in his life. Actually, if you look at the town seal of Greenwich, Connecticut, pictured on that seal is Israel Putnam doing his famous daredevil ride. He was headquarters in the Greenwich area, and on a particular day, he was on a patrol with a number of his troops, a fairly small number of troops, and was stationed at a tavern there. And he was having his breakfast when the large number of British troops came marching up the fields. And he got his men out there and held them back as long as he could. And then when it was obvious that they were totally outnumbered, he told his troops to disperse into the swamps nearby. And he mounted on his horse, stayed to the last minute. And when they were almost within touching distance of him, he turned his horse and rode down this rustic stairway. It's composed of, they say, 100 steps carved out of the granite of the hillside, and had made a daredevil ride down that hill that none of the British troops would follow him. Said that his cap was shot off his head as he was riding down, and his clothes were riddled with bullets, but he made it down to the bottom of the hill, and no one followed him. He rode onwards. He organized troops to come back and face the British. That's one of his daredevil feats.
One of the other stories I'd love for you to tell, and this is another thing that kind of set him apart from maybe some of his colleagues, was he was not what I would call a sort of blood and guts soldier, couldn't wait to stab him and kill him and get rid of him. He actually had empathy, and he would help wounded soldiers. And there's a great story in your book about one of the British soldiers who was left for dead and spoke to him and said, "I need for you to please bring me somebody who could write out my last will because I'm obviously not going to live." Could you tell us that story?
Yeah, Israel Putnam was a genuinely good man. He's probably one of the few people in history who could say he was thoroughly good and thoroughly brave. And he did. He was filled with empathy. On this particular occasion, he decided, yes, I will help you out. I will, get one of your friends from the British lines to help you make your will. But he knew that if he did that, the person who came would see that. He only had 50 troops left at that point. And if he reported that to the British, they would be overrun immediately. So he decided, sent a messenger to the British troops and told them to bring the fellow, but don't bring him until after dark. Campfires would be lit throughout the area. Candles would be put in every window of the encampment. While the friend was there helping him make the will, he had the 50 troops that he had march back and forth, sometimes past the windows in twos and threes, sometimes the whole group marching back and forth to convince the visitor that there were a large number of troops there. And in fact, he did report that there were thousands of troops present there. The fellow that he helped out did indeed survive. In fact, he was treated by a physician who also happened to have been one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. which made the remarkable feat of being the only British officer to have been treated medically by a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
Now, let me ask you this question, Michael. You've delved into Israel Putnam's life incredibly deeply, and you've assembled all these stories. As you said, he was number two only to George Washington. And when you look at the plethora of military figures we've had over time in the United States, our relatively short history, where do you rank him? Right at the very top of our military heroes?
I would say so. He was the man who was in exactly the right place at the right time for a man of his talents. Actually, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, he was probably second only to Benjamin Franklin in terms of fame throughout Europe and America. He was certainly more famous than George Washington. He was a excellent tactician, a terrible strategist. He couldn't see overall strategies. The situations were so different that he'd certainly be up there with Grant and Patton and Eisenhower.
I do want to say the thing that struck me almost more than anything else about him, and there's so much to strike you about him, was that he was always the last one off the battlefield. He made sure his other soldiers got off before he did. That was just a testament to the man, I think.
He was always put in absolutely terrible situations, particularly during the first dreadful year of the Revolution, where everything went wrong for the Americans. But he was there and he'd hold the position until it could not be held anymore against totally overwhelming forces. And then he would manage to get his men away safely in impossible situations again. Got them out of the Battle of Brooklyn, got them out of Washington Heights. When he was in the Battle of Long Island, he kind of takes the heat for having lost that one. He was there with 6,000 men against 30,000 British troops and still managed to get all his people safely away. And then in the Battle of Manhattan, he managed to get his troops out of Lower Manhattan safely, despite all odds. And then, when he was trying to defend the Hudson River with 600 men against the entire British fleet and army, he still managed to do pretty well there. Incredibly difficult situations.
One of Putnam's hardest undertakings as a commander was his decision to have 2 Patriot soldiers executed during the winter encampment in Reading in 1778. They had deserted their troops, and Putnam felt an example needed to be made. One was hanged, the other killed by firing squad. Well, after their deaths, all of the remaining 1,000 soldiers had to march past their open coffins to drive home at a critical point in the Revolutionary War, the point that anyone trying to leave their military company would face a similar outcome. There were no more desertions after that incident. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Michael Westerfield, author of Israel Putnam, America's First Folk Hero. You can get his book at Etsy.com. The answer to this week's trivia question. The question was, 70 years ago, there was a fatal car crash not unlike the Princess Di case in France, where paparazzi chased an internationally famous movie star on a back road in Connecticut, only it was the reporter who was killed. And who was that famous star? Well, the answer is Marilyn Monroe, a resident at the time of beautiful Roxbury, Connecticut. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to look at Marilyn Monroe's time in Roxbury when she was married to famous playwright Arthur Miller of Death of a Salesman fame. And we're going to take a look at that fatal car crash, and it occurred the day that Monroe and Miller became engaged. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.